What? Did he just say that? Is this the same Alex? This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. I can't believe this. Hello everyone, welcome to this video. So YouTuber Alex O'Connor, CosmicSkeptic, has recently uploaded a podcast with Peter Singer, philosopher. He wrote the book Animal Liberation. I'm pretty sure that book is what influenced CosmicSkeptic to go vegan. But it's a very interesting discussion, actually. I was actually quite interested when I was watching it because I was like, oh, what angle is Alex going to go with? Because just for a little bit of backstory, Alex O'Connor was a practicing vegan, quite recently put up a community post saying he's not vegan anymore. He was quite ambiguous at the start. He mentioned a few things that didn't make sense, and then he came out with a video saying that he had some health issues that prevented him from eating a plant-based diet, and my opinion was he didn't do enough due diligence with his health issues, and I thought it was a bit of a cop-out. And I assumed it was some of his philosophical views that kind of influenced his decision. I was quite critical of him espousing some views that were quite utilitarian. Utilitarian sort of maximizes the consequences of an action, just looks at something in terms of the amount of well-being or suffering it produces. And a lot of utilitarians that I see, they're mostly suffering focused. So like a negative utilitarian would be focused on reducing suffering, and I see a lot of that. And that kind of leads you open to reductios, where you kind of reduce a position down to absurdity, where like it gets to this point where like if you just kill someone and shoot them in the back of the head and don't cause them any suffering, then that's fine to do on a utilitarian view. Peter Singer is a utilitarian, quite a famous utilitarian, and I was actually quite surprised. But it came across that for the most part, Alex was really challenging Peter Singer on his utilitarian views when it comes to animal ethics. And there's a lot to discuss in this video, actually. So I thought, should I discuss everything that I disagree with in this video? And I don't think that we have time. So basically, Alex quite rightly says, do you think it's right that you called the father of the animal rights movement when you don't even have an animal rights position? You're a utilitarian. I don't want to misquote anyone, but just watch it. He also, Alex also pushes him on free-range eggs, and Peter Singer says it's fine to eat free-range eggs. He did talk about it in terms of a certain category, but then he also mentioned that free-range hens are murdered after their egg production declines, and also the male chicks are killed on the day of hatching. So he knows about all that. And there's also the problem with the egg laying. There's problems with free-range eggs, but of course you wouldn't hear an animal rights activist say it's okay to eat free-range eggs, knowing all the issues and knowing the hens are murdered. I disagree with Peter Singer. I think he's got his reasons for believing what he believes, and I think a lot of it stems from the fact that he's a utilitarian. But I was actually quite surprised to see Alex push back on it. And part of this discussion I want to focus mostly on, because there was a lot there and there's a lot to respond to. This would be a 3-hour video, literally. But it's where Alex starts pushing him on humane killing. So let's go.
You said you could imagine a world in which people mostly eat plant-based foods, but occasionally treat themselves to the luxury of free-range eggs, or possibly even meat from animals who live good lives under conditions natural for their species, and are then humanely killed on the farm. That's the quote that jumped out of me, and I think the words there, humanely killed, are seen by many, if that killing is unnecessary, as a contradiction in terms.
I'm liking it. Let's see how Peter Singer responds. I cut a bit out of his response. It's too long. He goes into free-range eggs for 7 minutes, and let's just focus on his humane killing response.
I can't say with any confidence that it's wrong to bring animals into existence, give them good lives, and then kill them in a way that causes them no suffering.
And here lies the problem. I actually haven't read Animal Liberation, and to call Peter Singer the father of the animal rights movement, I think is completely wrong, and I don't think we should do it. If anything, he's a philosopher, utilitarian animal ethics philosopher. He does bioethics and things like this, but he's definitely not the father of the animal rights movement. If I were to pick a person to be the father of the animal rights movement, it'd be someone like Tom Reagan, who wrote a book on animal rights, because this is the kind of things that Peter Singer speaks about. I mean, there's probably a bunch of points me and Peter Singer agree on, but something like this, something as morally repugnant as not seeing an issue with breeding beings into existence to slaughter them and eat them. He did say in this conversation, I want to be very clear, that he wants to see the end of animal exploitation. He just doesn't know how we're going to get there.
Now, of course, I want the abolition of animal exploitation, full stop.
But how could you want to see the end of animal exploitation, Peter Singer, if you also have a view that you can't see that it's wrong to breed beings into existence, give them sentience, and then rob that sentience from them in order to eat them? That's where utilitarian leads you. But Alex actually does a really good job pushing him here. Let's go.
I don't know any philosopher who could really argue without solving Parfit's problems that is unequivocally wrong.
But indeed, the reason why it's a problem, and I think you're raising something of a non-identity problem here. We've got this situation in which bringing a being into existence, in some sense, requires this negative aspect. In this case, it would be a premature death. And you say something like, well, maybe it would be better to not have that premature death, but if it weren't for the fact that we were going to kill them, they wouldn't exist at all, and they have an overall good life that's worth living, then if those are the options, no life at all, or a life that involves the premature death, what's the problem with favouring the latter? And you say, and as I say, the reason I think this is a problem is because if we look in a human context, it seems that our intuitions are screaming at us that to do this to a human being would be an ethical abomination.
I'm not sure if Alex has been listening to the criticisms of humane slaughter, utilitarianism, or whether he already had this view and he was just being sympathetic to this humane killing concept in his, what I would consider harmful conversation he had with Michaela Peterson. Peterson popularized the marginal argument from marginal cases, which is like there are marginal case human beings, they might have a mental disabilities of some sort. They might be incapacitated in some way. Basically, human intelligence exists on this kind of bell curve. Would we justify killing human beings of this low, say the mental capacity of a cow for food, or doing what we do to cows to these human beings? And it seems like Alex is using his argument from marginal cases against him. Basically, what he has to do to have the view that you can bring beings into existence, right, and kill them without suffering, he has to either contradict himself or be consistent. And I'll let you find out which path he chooses. And Alex does a really good job here.
To raise human beings, and perhaps you could keep them isolated so they don't know what's going on. Maybe they're in some kind of cult that thinks that once you turn 18 years old, you sort of go into a different realm or something, but you take them through the door and you slice their throats. Maybe you put a bolt through their head first if you're feeling particularly humane. I think people would ridicule this view, especially if it was promoted as a form of humanely killing them, because sure, it's humane in comparison to what we might do on a factory farm, but perhaps compared to what the moral worth of these beings require, to call it humane would be something of a travesty. At least in a human context, I would imagine you would think that that would be at least wrong and possibly grossly wrong.
Whoa, you might have imagined wrong. But what Alex is trying to do is he's creating basically the very, very important thing about hypotheticals is it tests the consistency of your moral view. Because there's no other way to test the consistency of your moral view unless it's in reality, you need these hypotheticals to sort of present your ethical view, your ethical framework, and then produce a hypothetical that tests it, and you can analogize. And what Alex is doing is he's trying to create a situation that's analogous and put humans in place of the animals, and seeing if Peter Singer will bite the bullet on that. It's really refreshing, actually, to see Alex challenging Peter Singer on these philosophical points about humane killing, because yes, our intuitions are screaming that it would be a moral abomination to accept a world that would breed humans into existence, give them good lives, humanely kill them, and then eat them. That would be like the plot of some horror movie.
So I think in a human context, it's not possible to avoid spillover effects in terms of, the acceptability of killing other humans. And I think that's really the problem.
So Peter Singer has responded by saying, the only problem with doing that is that there would be a spillover effect. So basically, if we accept humans being killed in that context, the ones that the context that I accept for non-human animals, then there would be this spillover effect that we accept killing humans here, so we might start murdering each other. That's the only thing. That's what he thinks is wrong with it. I'm sorry to just absolutely laugh, but that is but Peter Singer accepts, right? This is the problem with Peter Singer, right? He applies the spillover effect argument here, but he doesn't apply the spillover effect argument when he says eat free range eggs. You can eat if food is going to go to waste, you can eat that meat. Wouldn't there be a spill out effect into other areas of your life if you accept? He's saying that you can eat humanely raised meat. all these times where he's saying it's okay to eat meat, his spillover effect is much more likely to happen in that scenario where people will be like, well, I eat meat in this context, I eat eggs in this context, I'm going to go get the full-on factory farm caged eggs, I'm going to get the factory farm bacon because I already see animal products as food. That's the spillover effect happening now. I mean, that's something that I truly believe, that if you allow animal products in certain situations, you're going to allow them in every other situation, and you're just going to be like, I eat animal products. That's how you identify yourself. And people just don't draw clear lines. So Peter Singer is, in my view, contradicting himself with this spillover effect idea that the only reason it's wrong to breed humans into existence and murder them humanely is because of this spillover effect, but he doesn't apply that to eating animal products in certain contexts. So let's keep going.
As humans, we want to go on living, clearly, and if we discover that humans are being killed in this way, that's going to mean that we're going to fear that there'll be less respect for human life and that we will be killed. I think there are consequences because of our consciousness, our awareness, and our understanding of what's going on.
He's saying that the only problem with it is not the intrinsic problem with it of murdering someone who wants to live, who should have like the right to life. The problem is that people that found out about this would get fear, and that would be a utilitarian problem because you can't have other humans having fear of being killed in this way. All Alex has to do now is just refine the hypothetical to be analogous and see if he still wants to continue down that road. Let's go.
For animals, that doesn't generally apply, I think. So I think as you say, the intuitions that we have that scream to us that this is wrong if done for humans, we don't have those about animals. And I think there may be, as I say, reasons why we don't have those about animals.
You don't have those about animals. I have those intuitions about animals. The crazy part is Peter Singer popularized the term, he didn't coin the term, but popularized the term speciesism. And it's quite ironic that he's got quite a speciesist position here.
No, you could say, well, that's just because we're speciesist and we use animals without thinking about their interests.
Well, there you go. There you go. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that you're speciesist in your position here.
But in these conditions that we've been talking about, I think it's very hard to argue that it is contrary to their interests. So
murdering them is not contrary to their interests. It's very hard to argue that. Well, as a utilitarian, if you believe that what matters is maximizing well-being, reducing suffering, right? So these are only two metrics, and you don't have rights in there, like someone has rights not to be exploited and killed or killed humanely. And basically his position is that they wouldn't have existed otherwise, so you're basically giving them this short-term happiness. From a utilitarian view, wouldn't it be wrong to just drain the utility from the moral universe by murdering them? Because basically there's this utility that exists, their well-being. You come up and shoot them in the back of the head just to eat them. But it's just a small amount of pleasure, right? Just let's do the pleasure calculus. Small amount of pleasure from eating the animals. You could basically flavor some tofu. You would get after you get used to the tofu, which is I love it now. There would be like this marginal difference in pleasure, right? But what you're talking about is robbing their pleasure to exist, which is a much deeper experience than taste pleasure, and draining that well-being from the moral universe. So even from a utilitarian, not even a rights standpoint, what you're doing is you're trading off their continued existence, right, from that point onwards, because they kill them at a young age, their continued existence, their depth of experience, and if you're saying they're having these good lives, you're robbing them of continuing that good life for a tiny bit of taste pleasure. I don't see how he's done his utility calculus here, but to me, that sounds like, even from a utilitarian standpoint, an unethical thing to do, maybe?
I wouldn't simply say, well, we wouldn't do this to humans, so therefore it must be wrong to do it to animals.
Why wouldn't you say that? That sounds like a speciesist position. At least if you... I can understand if a human has... if you care about sentience and a human being has a greater level of sentience and depth of experience to another animal, right? Let's just say it's a fish or a chicken. Then I can understand if you have a choice between that, all things remaining equal. Let's just say it's a neutral human being. They're not an evil person or anything. And a neutral, say, fish or chicken. Then it would be a greater wrong to kill that human because you're robbing a greater depth of experience from the world. So only in that case would you make that that distinction there. But we're talking about killing them for taste pleasure, raising them, breeding them into existence and killing them for taste pleasure, all right, which is something we don't need to do at all. But what you can then do is you could just level out the experience of the human to the chicken, let's just say, and say, which one is it okay to kill now? If your metric for morality is sentience, you just level out their sentience, and one's a human, one's a chicken. Like, you do have, there are, like Peter Singer has his marginal case argument, there are marginal case human beings, or there are human beings with these kind of, the same capacity of, say, a cow or a chicken. They do exist, and we would protect them. So yeah, so I don't see why not. It's an argument from consistency. We're both sentient beings. You argue that speciesism is not right. It's a form of discrimination like racism or sexism. But at the same token, you now have contradicted yourself, and using a speciesist position. Maybe Alex needs to further his hypothetical so that he does sort of equalize the experience of the human and the animals further, so he can see that it's even more of a contradiction. Let's go.
So to be clear, in the situation I described of raising isolated human beings until they're 18 and then killing them secretly, the thing that's wrong about that, in your view, is just the fact that there's a risk that this might cause other human beings to be scared that somehow they're going to get caught up in it. I mean, I can imagine very strict laws in place that unless you were born a member of this particular set of human beings who are bred in particular to be kept isolated and to be bred for food, perhaps for just the sake of our taste pleasure, unless you're a member of that group, you're not allowed to be touched by anybody. You can imagine the laws are incredibly strict on this. And you could say, sure, well, there's a sense in which people might think there's a disrespect for human lives that may one day eventually evolve into a problem for us. But you could say the same thing about animal consumption. You could say, if we're going to begin to recognize a speciesism in the way that we think, and we're kind of okay with killing animals, then shouldn't we be terrified that one day we'll be okay with killing humans too? And we think no, because we've put very strict boundaries around this, not just morally, but also legally, that sure, you can kill a pig, but you can't kill a human being. In this situation where I'm killing human beings early-ish in their lives, say 18 years old, none of the humans who are going to be killed find out. All of the humans who do know about this practice know that they're never going to be a member of that group of people. Is the only thing that could be wrong with that, in your view, just the small risk that sort of something might go wrong there and people might be scared? Is there not something wrong with the killing?
Yeah, is that the only thing wrong with it? That people would be scared? This is why there's a huge problem with pure utilitarianism. In my view, right, and I think in most rational people's view, you need to have a combination of rights and factoring in well-being and suffering. And there needs to be kind of like a threshold, threshold deontology is something that I learned from two YouTube philosophers, Avi and Isaac, where, if you have pure rights, there's got to be a point to which you scale up the suffering on the other end of an action to which, let's just say, if killing this person and violating their rights stopped a universe full of suffering, to not kill that human would be, even though it would be respecting this deontologic rule of not killing, it would be a moral crime not to kill and rob that individual's rights, because let's just say there's 10 million or 100 million people who will suffer to death if you don't do it. So that's why there needs to be a combination. There's some threshold to which you would have to forego the right of the being, and where that threshold hit it would be quite high, because otherwise you could justify things like medical testing you could justify things like taking 5 organs out of one person. So I'm not saying just because 3 people benefit from one person, the rights would still protect them. It would be some higher threshold, really high. But this is where utilitarianism goes really wrong when you don't have rights in there, is because he's more concerned with a few people getting scared than someone being murdered and eaten. A human being being murdered and eaten. Why do you think murder is so wrong? It's wrong because they had a prospect to continue their existence, and that's why we have very strict murder laws, because no one wants to be murdered. You lose your life. You lose your life. We should have sovereignty over our own lives. We should have a right to our own existence. You shouldn't be able to take that away from someone. And if you did it in a way that no one knew about it and no one else suffered and they had no family members, it's still wrong. It's intrinsically wrong.
I mean, you also have to say, of course, that these humans would not have existed at all. There's no way in which they would have come into existence, except that they were going to be killed at 18 for some reason.
Yes, to the same extent that an animal on a humane farm, as you describe it, might not have existed unless it was going to be killed for food.
Yeah. I see. I mean, I think you're describing a situation that is hypothetical to test our intuitions, which is perfectly fine. I don't think that there could be a real world analog of this.
The idea of hypotheticals is to test your moral view for consistency, logical consistency, and we want to put your ethical views to the test. He's a philosopher. He's a professor. He understands the value in hypotheticals. Now, if he's going to say, well, that's not a real world scenario, but that's where your moral view leads. And there are very real world applications of this in action. And there are potential horrific applications of the philosophy of pure utilitarianism. And I can think of so many. Like if 5 people get more pleasure than from raping one individual, even if it's one increment more pleasure, that increment would then favor it as being good. Even there are so many real-world applications of a pure utilitarian view that are sick if you don't have rights in there. So he's saying that this is hypothetical, doesn't apply to the real world. Yes, it does.
But if you say, let's ask that question hypothetically under these circumstances, then I agree. It's very hard for a utilitarian to say why this is wrong, given that these 18-year-olds have good lives that they would not have had otherwise, and we have to assume, of course, that nobody else is harmed by this. So that's another hypothetical thing that we haven't really touched on.
So Peter Singer just bit the bullet, kind of thing, on not as a utilitarian, not seeing why it's wrong to breed humans into existence that would not have otherwise existed. And killing them to eat them at 18 years old, so long as no one else is harmed because of it. It's an absolute disgusting rights violation. Any human rights activist would think this is just this absolute sickening view. Basically, what you're saying is a human holocaust for taste pleasure. They would be like a minority group of beings who didn't ask to exist, who were existing for 18 years and killed before their time just so we could eat them, literally. That's what he doesn't see a problem with.
Presumably, they have mothers anyway, who might care for them and don't want to be separated from them and want to know what happens. You could say, okay, well, let's assume we've developed gestation, in a serum or something like that. So they actually have no mothers. We've produced the eggs and the sperm, and
you could just remove the mother out of the like. He sees where this is going. You could just keep altering the hypothetical and see where his view lies. I mean,
yeah, if you do all that, then it's difficult for me to say this is intrinsically wrong.
It's difficult to say this is intrinsically wrong. I mean, I think that this is where he just lost the entire population of people. This is why I have a rights-based view. I say rights-based because it does factor in suffering and well-being as well, and you also have to factor in the rights of others, and as long as there's no rights competing, and you have a right to defend yourself and things like this. But you just lost everyone, mate. You just bit the bullet on, this is why utilitarian, I think it's just laughable at a certain point. Pure utilitarianism has really, utilitarianism, you could think of contexts where it's really helpful, but you can just think of contexts where it reduces to absurdity.
Or I might draw a further analogue with the animals and say that these animals also have mothers or children, depending on sort of when they're being killed, who might sort of emotionally depend on each other as well. And you'd sort of run into potentially the same problems.
Yeah, so basically he was saying as long as the human beings didn't have mothers and they were kind of born in a test tube, that would be okay. But the animals in animal agriculture on this free-range farm would also have family, is what Alex is saying. So I don't see how that's is that what you call a category error? He can't impart that on the hypothetical in the human case, because in the animal case they do have families, so you would have to basically embed that into the human hypothetical and say they do have families, they're born to mothers, but you would have to kind of equalize the human mothers and the same amount of suffering a cow or like mammals, these mammals that we use for their flesh, the same amount of like mourning and suffering would be in the human case. That's how I would apply that hypothetical, and I think that's what Alex is saying here. So I think it's important that when you're using in the human case that you try to equalize the experience of both the human and the cow. You sort of create that hypothetical, and then it basically becomes much more analogous.
So, I mean, a humane beef farm or something is still going to involve killing animals who have relations to other animals that are at least seemingly going to be emotionally distressed by that. But also, I mean, whichever way we sort of make the analogues actually analogous, can you understand why some people would see this as something of a reductio ad absurdum of the utilitarian position? The idea that, yes, sure, I have an intuition that suffering is bad, and I think that a lot of the strength of utilitarianism comes from that intuition that when we experience suffering, we know that it's bad for us. But we also have a pretty strong intuition that killing humans, even in the conditions that I've described, would be wrong. And some people sort of weigh these up and they say, as sensible as utilitarianism seems in the abstract, in principle, if it does lead to such a conclusion, it simply can't be right.
Alex, mate, is this the same Alex? I remember him saying that animals don't have a right to life because they die in crops in a video. So that was like, he's saying animals shouldn't have rights, shouldn't have legal rights. So this is actually interesting to see him take this position. I don't know if he held this position before. It felt like he didn't. But now he's pushing Peter Singer on the fact that the utilitarian reduces to absurdity when you start making these kind of hypothetical situations. Because let's just say you wanted to create laws based on utilitarianism and only on utilitarianism, because that, for me, these moral concepts, these moral frameworks you should be able to apply them into law, shouldn't you? If you applied utilitarianism into law, date rape would be legal. Because you could put someone to sleep, you could rape them, and if they woke up and didn't feel anything and you'd got pleasure from it, a utilitarian position would say that's absolutely fine. But a rights position would say, well, you just violated their right to bodily integrity, to sovereignty over their own body. You just raped them. And our laws are based on rights. Our laws are based off of human rights, aren't they? They're rights-based laws. Like, it's wrong to murder unless it's in self-defense, okay? But if you go to the judge, hey, I killed them, they didn't have any family, no one knew about it, I disposed of their body, I shot them straight in the head, they died humanely, and I ate them, and I got some pleasure out of it. And they didn't even have a family. No one even knew about it. No one suffered because of it. No one got scared because of it. That is the insanity of applying utilitarianism, pure utilitarianism, into law. Think about it. Does he disagree with rights in law? Does he disagree with the if you violate these rights to not want to be sexually abused and murdered? Does he disagree with those being encoded into law, rights-based laws? This is actually really good from Alex.
So I don't accept that the judgments that you make under hypothetical circumstances, which are not part of the real world, are a test of the underlying ethical theory.
What? Did he just say that? He said that the hypothetical you just created does not test the underlying theory. They literally are the test of the underlying theory. What are you talking about? Of course they test the underlying theory. Is Alex supposed to take it out to the real world and just do it and see if you consider it moral or immoral? He has to produce a hypothetical to test your ethical theory. There's no other way. And there are literally things that happen in the real world that do test utilitarianism. Like the case with 5 people gaining pleasure off of sexually abusing one person. You know, these things happen all the time. Are you supposed to say, well, you know, they got more pleasure than suffering out of that? So yeah, I think that that's actually, it should be legal. Like, you're never going to say that. So utilitarianism does apply out to the real world, and the only way to test it is by applying a hypothetical to test its consistency and seeing where it reduces to, what the reductio is, which Alex did. Now you're saying that I don't think that Let's just repeat it.
So I don't accept that the judgments that you make under hypothetical circumstances, which are not part of the real world, are a test of the underlying ethical theory.
What a cop-out. I can't believe that, because he just reduced you to absurdity, the position to absurdity. And Peter Singer is a very intelligent person. He's a professor. He's much more educated than I'll ever be, probably. But I just don't... I think he's really trying to hold on to this utilitarianism stuff.
Because the judgments we make are those that we have intuitively. You've used the word, our intuitions yourself, that have evolved and developed in circumstances that are part of the real world.
This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. I can't believe this. You could apply utilitarianism out to the real world right now, and it's insane. It leads to insane conclusions. So am I supposed to say, what Peter Singer said, utilitarianism, you just, is the way to go. So if I just make some calculus of well-being over suffering, whatever, and don't factor in the rights of the individual, then if I get extreme amounts of pleasure from torturing one dog, and it just outweighs the calculus of suffering, then I can just go around torturing dogs. Utilitarianism has really insane real-world applications, pure utilitarianism.
And it's very good in the real world that we have this strongly negative intuition that to kill an innocent human being, I would say, unless they strongly request it for some good reason, like they're terminally ill, to kill an innocent human being is wrong. So, it's not that I want to change the intuitions. I'm just saying when you give purely hypothetical examples, they don't refute the underlying theory, because the intuitions are ones that have arisen in circumstances other than the hypothetical ones you've described.
That was just a bunch of nonsense, in my view. No, the hypothetical is testing your ethical view, and it leads to absurdity, okay? And you're saying we should have these intuitions that killing a human is wrong, but in your ethical view, it's not necessarily wrong. So which one is it? Obviously we should have human rights protecting us from murder, yeah? And why wouldn't those human rights apply to the people in the human farm scenario that Alex proposed? All of a sudden human rights don't matter? I don't know. It's just utilitarianism is not a rights approach. We need rights protecting us. We need them, as well as we need to factor in well-being and suffering as well. But we need rights, and animals need rights. That's the only thing that's going to protect them. Animal rights encoded into the law books is the only thing that will actually protect them. Not this calculus of a little bit of suffering over well-being and this and that. No, they need a right in law saying that we cannot kill them for our own ends.
I'm sort of imagining an argument from marginal cases that might be put forward here. It's interesting. I mean, you're the person who popularized the term speciesism in many people's account. And speciesism is something like the unwarranted differential treatment or discrimination on the basis of species alone. It seems to me that if you can imagine a world, as you write in this interview, in which people sometimes enjoy the luxury of humanely killed animals from a humane farm, but you can't imagine the same thing for human beings. You say that there's sort of a practical reason why you think that human scenario could never occur. But suppose it was on a very strict metric. Suppose it was something to do with mental capacity. Let's imagine that if a human being is born with such a limited cognitive capacity that they essentially don't have any self-awareness, or they sort of just don't know what's going on, or there's some kind of cognitive test that we install that says that if you're below a certain cognitive ability, if the mother consents, if the parents consent, then we're able to kill these. Suppose we find that they taste really, really nice, and there's sort of a luxury meat market for these disabled children. And perhaps some parents are intentionally having these children, and we say, look, you don't need to fear that this is going to affect our general view of killing other human beings, because this only applies to a very strict set of human beings that were intentionally created for this purpose, have very limited cognitive capacities. Even if we could imagine such a world, I think we would imagine it with some disgust. But I don't think there's a way to picture that world with disgust. But picture a world in which we're killing humanely raised animals with no problem, without committing ourselves to some charge of speciesism.
So what Alex has done here is he's used Peter Singer's argument from marginal cases against Peter Singer's utilitarian view, and he's seeing that there's a contradiction here, or it's speciesist. Peter Singer helped popularize the term speciesism, and I can't believe you can't see this as a blatant speciesism. You wrote the book Animal Liberation. Like, I've got to read this book. I think he talks about speciesism in there. I've heard him talk about speciesism in some of his speeches. I've watched a fair few of Peter Singer's speeches. I can't believe he doesn't see this. And Alex is pointing this out to him, and Alex was inspired to go vegan from Peter Singer, and probably one of the reasons why Alex is not a vegan anymore, but he didn't have that rights-based view. But it seems to me like Alex is really pushing on this. He won't let it go. I mean, this is the longest part of the discussion, because Alex keeps pushing him on it, trying to get him to bite this bullet. He really wants to know if this is his position, and I think he's making it very crystal clear with his questioning and the way that he's formulating his hypotheticals and the way that he's equalizing the human scenario with the animal scenario. He's really getting to the bottom of Peter Singer's position, just to make 100% crystal clear what his position is. And let's just see where it goes. Let's just see where Peter Singer, he's either going to contradict himself and say that even if we equalize the human scenario with the animal scenario, it's still not okay to do it to the humans, but it's okay to do it to the animals. That would be a contradiction. Or he's got to say it's actually okay to do it to both humans and animals when you equalize these traits that I would consider morally relevant. So let's see which way he goes.
But I don't agree with that, because, as you said, when speciesism is the unwarranted discrimination against beings on the basis of their species. So the question of what's warranted and what isn't is obviously there.
I just don't get it, man. I can see that Peter Singer is not so sure about. Well, I feel like he's under a bit of pressure here, because Alex has got him in the spot where I would get him. Actually, it's just exactly where I would go with Peter Singer. And I've gone here before with other utilitarians, and they almost always, to be like, just to remain consistent, to save face, whatever it is, go with biting the bullet. And then you just scale up and watch them like go, oh my God, I've just bit the bullet on some horrible thing. But I can just see he's uncomfortable here with answering this.
But it's not, in any case, in the case that I'm talking about, I think it's not the species that's doing the work. It's the lack of awareness of the circumstances on the part of the being. And if you're saying, well, this could apply to human beings, again, hypothetically under some circumstances, yeah, it could.
There you go. Instead of contradicting himself, he's chosen to remain consistent. This is what utilitarians generally do. They will be like, it's okay in the animal case, and it's also okay in the human case. And then you just scale up the human case. Say it's okay to do it to humans, is it? If you equalize these traits. Yes, well then, is it okay to do it to 1 trillion of these humans? Universe is full of these humans. Like, just keep scaling it up, and they'd have to say, yeah, it is.
But that, then we've again stepped into this hypothetical realm where I don't think our intuitions are decisive in saying whether this is right or wrong.
The point of hypotheticals is to test your moral view, and it's done a very good job at testing your moral view. And that moral view leads to absurdity, and it's not one that I'd implore anyone who has this utilitarian moral view where they just focus on the suffering, reducing suffering, or this well-being suffering calculus, and they don't have rights in their view, to really look at this discussion here and see where it leads. Would you want a society that built laws off of this principle? I wouldn't. I'd rather the rights-based approach that we have right now for humans. And I want it for animals too.
Yeah, I mean, I think people listening will perhaps see what you're saying and understand why it's difficult to condemn as a utilitarian this treatment of humans in the hypothetical scenario. And as you say, this is a hypothetical just to test our intuitions. But I suppose what I'm trying to do is figure out what it is that's wrong. And I just want to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly.
Alex is just really making sure here. And he's really pushing him here. Like, I expected maybe to go off on a different topic, but he's really trying to get to the bottom of it. Like 1,000,000% get to the bottom of it.
In the situation of killing human beings early on in their lives, is the thing that's wrong with it, the sort of knock-on effect this is going to have psychologically on other human beings? Is it, in other words, not wrong for the person being killed?
Just the silence there. So you're saying it's only bad for the others who might know about it, but it's not bad for the one that's being murdered, essentially. The silence is just...
It's okay. So
Well, not bad, I
yes,
should say.
basically the reason it's wrong is the knock-on psychological effects.
Oh my God, dude. The reason it's wrong is only the knock-on effect it would have of me murdering someone. It's not wrong for murdering someone.
Is it wrong for the person being killed as part of an overall practice where the person being killed would not have existed if that person were not going to be killed at some relatively early age, and if the life that the person has is a good one up to that point, then I would have to say that the overall practice is not wrong for the person being killed. The person couldn't complain because the response would be, you wouldn't have even existed and you've enjoyed the years that you've had. So we haven't wronged you.
I cannot believe... I honestly am shocked he just said that, eh? An individual, a conscious, feeling, intelligent, sentient human being could be in the world, and just because we gave them life, you think it's then okay, or they couldn't complain for being murdered. I think that's a twisted view. Once one has sentience or a conscious experience, they then have a right to continue that conscious experience. We do not have a right to take that from them, even if we brought them into the world in a test tube. All right, you claim to be the father of the animal rights movement, or maybe he doesn't claim that, but people call him the father of the animal rights movement. This has nothing to do with rights. This is a twisted kind of plot of a horror movie. If any of these views are in that book, Animal Liberation, I would not read it, or I would not. You could read it. Obviously, you could read it, but if these views are in there, then they need to be challenged. Obviously, people can have their view. Obviously, Peter can have his view, but it's an insane bullet to bite. I just can't believe it. That is oppression. That is just crazy violation of a sentient being's right to exist, and a complete inconsistent, insane, just hypocritical position like a human race could take, that we would take these human beings, breed them into existence in test tubes, provided they wouldn't have had life otherwise, given them a good life, and then shoot them in the head at 18 and eat them. I just can't imagine anyone would hold the position that that's okay. I've met, actually, there are some, but I see them as like just a bit loony. I would never accept that. I would be fighting for the rights of those human beings, and I'd be trying to stop it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm presuming if you asked the person in question, sort of, have you had a good life? Would you rather have not been born at all? They would probably say that they'd rather be born and undergo that experience.
I would contest that. No, you wouldn't want to be born and experience life and then only to be shot in the head. I just don't know how as a society we could accept a standard like that. Like, you're bringing your children into existence, you know what I mean? They didn't ask to be brought into existence and then to be murdered, you know what I mean? They didn't ask for that. It would just be a crazy standard to hold, like, okay, I brought my kids into existence, you know what I mean? And you wouldn't have existed otherwise. Do you like existing? Okay, well then it's fine to murder you then, like, you know what I mean? It's okay now because you wanted to exist. Well, now that you know what existence is, you want to exist. That very fact that that we believe existing in a happy state is good. It's an injustice to rob that from someone after they do exist. I mean, it's just a crazy... it's just morally repugnant, you know what I mean? It's just wrong.
For most people, there does still seem to be something wrong with this, and Parfit imagines that we have a few intuitions and we essentially have to abandon one of them. We either have to abandon the idea that you can somehow... I mean, he says that you must, in order to harm someone, you must leave them worse off. That's one intuition that we have. Another intuition is situations like this where we kill human beings who otherwise wouldn't have existed at all is wrong. And I think there's one other. And he essentially says, look, these all seem intuitively true, but we have to abandon one of them. And I guess for most people, they'd probably abandon one of the other ones. But it's interesting to hear you just, I guess not abandon, because you might not share that intuition, but to bite that bullet.
It's interesting to hear him bite the bullet. Yes, it is. It's. I can't believe he would bite that bullet. Of course, Peter Singer understands this. He's a professor who does talks, and he's incredibly world-renowned, this guy. Like, everyone knows him. They teach about him in ethics classes. If his views are being taught about in ethics classes, I mean, I'd probably contact the school and go, please, do not teach people about this view on whether or not it's okay to kill people if they had a good life. And Alex, it's just interesting to hear you bite the bullet on murder, essentially, and just throwing rights out the window. Like human rights. His ethical theory has now been tested. It's reduced to absurdity. And these ethical frameworks we should be encoding into law, really. It's supposed to be something that we should apply out to society with these ethical views. In my view, like, if we have these ethical views, we should look at how to encode them into law. And we already have a pretty good one called human rights. You know what I mean? And I don't know why we shouldn't apply that to animals, because otherwise we have a direct contradiction there. But but the way Peter Singer stays consistent is he said, I don't believe that in rights for humans or animals. That's what he's done. So if you're a person who believes in rights for humans, right, you should also apply that same idea to, or that same principle to non-human animals, basically, to be consistent. Or you could say we both don't deserve rights and take Peter Singer's view, reduce to absurdity and bite the bullet on, this context in which you can just breed as many people and kill them and eat them as much as you want for eternity. And I don't want to see a world like that. I think that's a great plot for a horror movie. I think there are a few horror movies that are similar to that. But yeah, that's where his view leads. And I think Alex has got a look of surprise on his face that he bit the bullet on that. But
yeah, I would bite that bullet. You're quite right. I mean, I think there is some intuition that has to go, and I'm going to stick with the one that says, to have harmed you, we have to have made you worse off than you would otherwise have been.
Well, what do you mean worse off than you would otherwise have been? You would never have existed. So I don't get it. So now you just got to say, if you're going to say existence is a good thing, and they led mostly good lives, but it's not wrong to rob that existence out of the moral universe. It's not wrong to drain that utility by murdering them. I just don't get it.
I guess that in a sentence is the rejoinder to this position of exploitation or anti-utilitarian sentiment that says there's still something wrong or there's still something harmful or bad about these practices, even if they don't inflict any suffering. And what you just said there, that in order to harm, you must leave someone worse off. You can't harm somebody by making them better off.
I consider murder harm. It depends on what you mean by harm. Is it the suffering, well-being calculus? Is it shooting someone in the back of the head and eating them? It's pretty harmful. Robbing their entire existence off of them, it's pretty harmful. I just don't know what you mean by harm. Their body's going to be dead and eaten.
You can't inflict a harm that leaves someone better off than they were otherwise. Or maybe you can.
Well, than they would otherwise have been, I think, is what you have to say, because,
yes.
Maybe you could have made them much better off, or they could have been much better off, but you stopped them being much better off.
Exactly. That's the problem with it. Like, what he's saying is that than they otherwise would have been, because they wouldn't have existed at all. So he's saying if you bring them into the world and give them this happiness, but then you can cut off that happiness at 18 years old. The reason he's saying otherwise would have been because they could have continued to be even more happy if you let them live. I just think it's so wrong, and I just think intuitively and also just ethically, like, it's just a human rights violation, and we shouldn't have a society that accepts these kind of human rights violations, and I think we should extend that to non-human animals as well. Okay, so Alex has taken the opposing view to Peter Singer in this. It feels like the way he words things, it's really ambiguous as to whether he's having these problems or whether he's just directly challenging utilitarianism. But it seems to me that Alex is directly challenging Peter Singer's position here on humane killing, which is actually, it's surprising and refreshing to see. So I think that's good. I don't know whether he already held these views, but he just had a few bad days or something, or I don't know. Him pressing Peter Singer on his utilitarianism was actually quite good to see. It's almost exactly the direction I would have went with him, and would try to have reduced it to absurdity myself, because I've done this so many times, and I always sit back in like astoundment that they would bite the bullet on that, because it just goes against the majority of people's intuitions when it comes to whether or not we should be able to do that to humans, or whether humans should have rights. This is why having rights in your ethical framework is so important, and this is why the animal rights movement is so important. We should factor in the suffering of the animals as well, but obviously we want them to have rights, so these situations cannot be used as a reason or as a justification, these situations of happy, humane farms, which in reality, whether that happens in reality is another question, because they get investigated and exposed all the time, and they're marginally different in terms, sometimes worse, it just depends in terms of welfare. If we believe in animal rights, then we boycott the industries that violate their rights, because then people won't be under any illusion that these animals are actually living net positive lives, because that is an illusion, and we don't want to have people to have that illusion, do we? We want to say, hey, you know what, they're violating their rights. Yes, they are being cruel. In some cases, they might be being less cruel than other cases, but in every case, they're violating their rights. They're being enslaved. They don't have any personhood. They don't have any real legal protection from them being murdered, and that's a rights violation. We should boycott it, and then we should create a culture of boycotting animal rights violations and promoting veganism and trying to get animal rights encoded into law, and at the same time exposing cruelties that happen in farms, and then there'll be a knock-on effect for animal welfare there, because the more they're exposed, the more they try to tighten up welfare. But in the meantime, we're fighting for animal rights and veganism. That's my view on that. Yeah, interesting. Cosmic Skeptic, pretty well done on this. I'm not sure if Cosmic Skeptic is thinking about going vegan again. He had a mountain of criticism. I criticized Cosmic Skeptic myself, but here I actually like this approach he's taking here, and I like him thinking about this topic. And I don't know whether it was all the videos about this that made him start thinking about this a little more, or whether he already had that view, but I don't know. I just actually don't know, but I'll just take this for face value right now. There's some stuff I disagree with in it, but like I'm going to say, in terms of Cosmic Skeptic pressuring Peter Singer on his views on animal ethics, I think he did a really good job here. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you learned a lot. And I'll see you all in the next video. And also, leave your comments down below. What do you think? What do you think? I obviously didn't address everything in the discussion. I addressed this part. What do you think? What do you think? Is Alex O'Connor going to be an animal rights activist? Is he going to be a threshold deontologist? Or is he going to stay with a utilitarian standpoint? Is he just going to be concerned as a negative utilitarian, concerned with suffering? Or is he going to, favor animal rights? That would be interesting. Yeah, and will he go vegan again once he sorts himself out? Who knows? But yeah, this was quite promising actually, but, have to wait and see.
I must say that I remain unconvinced on a great many of the points that you've put forward here, but I'm glad that we had the opportunity to discuss them. Peter Singer, thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast.